Okay, welcome to the second video of the week. In this video, I'm going to introduce two of our authors this week, Ovid and Marcus Aurelius. And this is a pretty interesting juxtaposition of Roman authors. Both of these authors are two of the most famous Roman authors. They're separated in time by a little over 150 years. And they're also very, very different. Not only are they writing in different genres, Ovid's writing in poetry, Marcus Aurelius is writing a kind of philosophy, but it seems to me they have a pretty different outlook on the world too. And so I think that pairing these readings together reminds us that the Romans are not one-dimensional. Out of necessity, we have to make a number of generalizations about the Romans. The Romans were like this, the Romans were like that. We have to do that to a certain extent, but we always need to remember that Romans were not all cut from the same cloth, and I think we'll see that today. So I'm going to start with the earlier of the two authors, Ovid, born in 43 BCE and died in 17 CE. Now, you should have heard the name Ovid before. Dr. Edmondson in last week's lecture talked a little bit about him, so I don't need to go into great detail here. I'll just remind you that Ovid was a leading Roman poet back in the days of Augustus, which means he was a contemporary with and admirer of Virgil. But you may recall that Ovid did not have a very happy ending to his life. He was exiled by Augustus in the year 8 CE and would live the remainder of his days in exile. Now, there's some controversy over exactly what it was that so angered Augustus that Ovid was banished. But I think this does point to something important, and that is a real chilling effect in the arts during the time of Augustus. During the days of the Republic, free speech was the rule of the day. Maybe not free speech in exactly the same sense we have it in this country. But you could say more or less what you wanted and get away with it. That was not going to be so in the days of Augustus. So artists are going to have to start minding their imperial P's and Q's at this point. Now, Ovid wrote a number of works. We are reading a selection from the Metamorphoses, or Changes. It's written shortly before his exile. I'll come back to that in a moment. It's a huge book. It's 15 books, 12,000 lines of poetry. We are just reading book 8 and a very small sliver of book 9. So we're just getting a little taste of this. It is an epic of sorts. So this is the third epic that we've encountered in this course. But it's not a conventional epic. It's not the kind of epic we saw with Homer or Virgil. Really, Ovid is telling the history of the universe, starting with the creation of the universe, ending with Julius Caesar, which brought things up to Ovid's own lifetime. So it's not that it's not a story that just follows one epic hero, as we saw with the Odyssey and the Aeneid. There are three major divisions in the work. The first several books have to do with stories primarily about the gods. Then there's a series of books that are primarily about heroes. So these are human beings who have some sort of divine lineage. And then finally, the last set of books are about human beings, and not just human beings, but I should say historical figures. So as we go along in the Metamorphoses, we sort of move from mythology to legend to something like history. Okay? So that's the progression of it. One of the things that binds the whole work together is that pretty much the whole thing is a reworking of Greek myths. So Ovid is not inventing a bunch of new mythology from scratch. And he's not even really just focusing on stories that were particular to the Romans. He is really going back to the Greeks. And so this is another really good example of one of those big trends we've been following as we've been studying the Romans, and that is Hellenization. How over time, Roman culture became more and more saturated with Greek elements. So here you have one of the leading Roman poets of the time of Augustus. He's writing in Latin, and this is arguably his greatest work. And what is he doing? He's retelling Greek myths. So very good illustration of Hellenization. And I should also say that nothing on this scale had ever been attempted before. So no Roman had ever tried to do this sort of comprehensive reinterpretation of Greek myths. So even though we might look at this and say, wow, that's not terribly original, because these are not stories that he came up with from scratch, certainly Ovid is highly creative in the way that he retells these stories. Speaking of creativity, there's some sort of, I want you to notice the artfulness with which Ovid tells his stories. At first blush, it might look like in our reading for this week, you just have a kind of random grab bag of stories about Greek heroes. But you'll notice, I think, that every story from book 8, and that's where almost all of our reading is from, every story has some connection to Theseus, the Athenian. And so be looking for that. Not every story has Theseus as a primary character. Usually there's some connection to Theseus there. And Theseus is an important character that we'll encounter again and again in this course in literature and in art. But what ties these stories together thematically? So from a narrative point of view, it's Theseus. But what about themes? What are the themes that keep on recurring in these stories? Well, I want to mention a few of them. And the first one I want to mention will take us right back to the Aeneid for a moment. The first theme is the power of furor, F-U-R-O-R. Furor as in strong emotion. So yes, furor can take the form of wrath, of anger, but it can also take the form of love or lust or a desire for vengeance or grief or envy or whatever. Okay, and really, in almost every one of these stories, with one exception, you see the characters being overcome with their particular furor. And this is actually points up a major difference between Virgil and Ovid. Virgil gives us Aeneas, who is the hero because he is able to overcome his own furor. Very few of the characters in Ovid are able to do that. Most of them are simply overcome. So it's more Dido than Aeneas in Ovid. There's one notable exception, as I mentioned. That's the story of Baucis and Philemon. So when you get to the story of Baucis and Philemon, Baucis is B-A-U-C-I-S, Philemon, just like the Philemon in the Bible. I think you'll see the difference. And I think the question you need to ask yourself as you're reading is, what makes it possible for Baucis and Philemon not to, give in to strong emotion? What makes them different from almost all the other characters that you encounter in your reading? So one of the big themes is human passions and their power to overcome us and their power to change us. Remember, the name of the book is Metamorphoses. And this brings us to the next major theme, which is simply that of change, right? That's no surprise given the title of the work. What Ovid seems to be suggesting in this work, not just by the title, but the stories within it, is that the world, reality, is in a constant state of flux, a constant state of change. And I think maybe he's trying to make a philosophical point there. But you've also got to think about the historical period in which Ovid is living. He is living in a time of profound change. His life spans that transition from republic to empire. So it's little wonder that somebody like Ovid would be fascinated by change because he was living through such dramatic changes. Another theme that perhaps is a little bit easier to miss, although I think it's pretty prominent, is nature. Ovid has a lot to say about nature, the natural world, and he seems to suggest that the natural world is mysterious, it is enchanted, it is imbued with life. So you'll encounter animals who were once people, nymphs who live in trees, rivers that are actually gods, islands that once were nymphs. So I think you'll see a lot of that. You'll also see that characters will suffer in many cases for violating nature, for violating the sanctity of nature. One kind of example of that is the very first story you'll read, which is about Scylla, the young woman who betrays her father because she's so infatuated with Nisus. And the betrayal of one's father is, of course, a very unnatural deed. But there are other good examples, too, and other examples that are more specifically pertinent to the natural world. So you've got Icarus. You probably know this story already. Icarus, who imitates bird flight and pays very dearly for it. The most obvious example comes at the very end of Book 8. You're going to read about a character named Erysichthon, Erysichthon. It's quite a mouthful, Erysichthon. He's going to be the most obvious example of a character who violates nature, willingly, knowingly violates nature, and pays for it terribly. What is Ovid trying to say with all this? I think what he's suggesting is that human beings are part of nature in some way. And just like we all know nature is in constant flux, you look outside and you see changes happening every day. Well, that's the way human beings are as well. We are constantly in a state of change. One last theme I want you to be on the lookout for as you read has to do with the gods. Even though these are stories about heroes, the gods certainly make appearances. There are stories told about the gods. And notice how the gods behave in these stories. Now, we all know, going back to Homer, we all know the Greco-Roman gods are not the best role models, morally speaking. But there's something about Ovid's gods. They are just especially badly behaved. And just as we see that human characters become captured and toppled by their own passions, you're going to see the same thing happen to the gods. So there's going to be several references in these stories to the jealousy of the gods. A god feels like he or she is slighted and then has to get revenge. You're going to read several allusions to gods raping women, gods who become overwhelmed by lust and take women by force. And I think there may be a political subtext here. Is it possible, at least, that what Ovid is doing is making some kind of commentary on the rule of Augustus? Augustus, who of course is the first Roman emperor. The gods in these stories are pretty tyrannical, capricious. They just sort of go by their whims. They are domineering in their power. Is it possible that this is a kind of commentary on Augustus's rule? It's possible. And in fact, some scholars have even wondered if this work is not the work that so angered Augustus that he exiled Ovid. We don't know for sure, probably never will know for sure, but it is a possibility at least. All right, that's all I want to say about Ovid. I'm going to move on to Marcus Aurelius. This means moving on well over a century in time. Marcus Aurelius ruled the Roman Empire from 161 to 180. He was the last of the so-called five good emperors. And Marcus Aurelius is a true rarity in world history, in that he is seen as both a great ruler and a great thinker, a great philosopher. Remember, this is in some ways Plato's ideal, right? That philosophers will also be the kings. Most of the time, that's just not been the case. Marcus Aurelius is one very interesting exception. Now, you're going to be reading book 2 of the Meditations, which is Marcus Aurelius' most famous work. So what is that? What are the Meditations exactly? Well, you'll notice if you look at the very beginning of the reading that there's an epigraph. The epigraph says, written among the Quadi on the river Gran. Well, the Quadi are a Germanic tribe of people. The river Gran is a tributary of the Danube River. So when Marcus Aurelius wrote this, he was on military campaign as Roman emperor. And it appears that he wrote the Meditations as a kind of personal journal, diary that he kept while he was on campaign. One thing that's interesting to note, because it corroborates something I was saying a moment ago, even though Marcus Aurelius was Roman, of course, and spoke Latin, of course, Meditations are actually written in Greek. So another really good example of the Hellenization of Roman culture. So we're reading the second book of 12. And what else can we say about this work other than the fact that it's a kind of diary? But obviously this is not the kind of diary that most of us would keep if we were going on a trip somewhere. So what is this exactly? Well, it's a work of philosophy. There's really no question about this. This is a work of philosophy. But it's a very different kind of work of philosophy than many others, and certainly very different than the works of philosophy that we've encountered so far in this class with Plato and Aristotle. Unlike Plato and Aristotle, he's not really interested in making a long, sustained argument. Think about the Credo and what Socrates is doing in the Credo. That's not the kind of work this is. Instead, this is a kind of collection of short, pithy sayings that are loosely related to one another. But he's not making a big, grand argument. You know, I think maybe for us, one of the best analogies here would be the book of Proverbs. The series of kind of memorable sayings that are meant to be very practical. Right? Proverbs is nothing but practical. And so is the Meditations. I mean, the Meditations, the part that we're reading, you know, Marcus Aurelius will say things like, well, begin every morning by doing this. I mean, you do not get more practical than that. It's not the kind of work of philosophy that says, what is the nature of being? Let's explore that for a minute. No, no, no. This is meant to be a very hands-on, practical guide to living. Okay. So Marcus Aurelius is claiming to write this for himself, first and foremost, but I think we can only imagine that he would be very pleased if other people benefited from it. So I think what we'll see, or what I hope you'll see as you read Book 2 of the Meditations, is that some of the same qualities that we've seen in Roman art this week are also present in this reading, particularly the three P's. Okay, I've already mentioned one of them, right? Practical. This is a highly practical work. One of your discussion forum questions this week has to do with that. Talk about some of the practical advice that Marcus Aurelius gives, and tell us what you think about it. Is it in fact practical at all? Is it helpful? Is it not so helpful? And so on. So I think you're very clearly going to see the practical nature of this work. Perhaps a little bit harder to see is that it's also, the second P, it is a pious work. A pious work in the sense that for Marcus Aurelius, the advice that he is dispensing in the Meditations is in no way in conflict with traditional Roman religion, traditional Roman beliefs about the gods. So philosophy is not an alternative to traditional Roman religion. It is really a kind of a supplement to it, a complement to it in some ways. The third P is political. And of course, you've got the fact that the person who's writing this just so happens to be the Roman emperor. But there's at least a place or two in this reading where he draws some sort of political conclusions from his philosophy. So I'll mention at least one of those. All right, I want to say a little bit now in the remainder of this video about the kind of philosophy that Marcus Aurelius espouses. He is not reinventing the wheel. He's not coming up with some new, unheard of philosophical school. He is very much in the tradition of Stoicism. Stoicism, which is, of course, originally a Greek philosophy. So another example, Hellenization. By the time Marcus Aurelius starts writing his Meditations, Stoicism had been around for about 500 years at that point. But Marcus Aurelius was not the first Roman to find great inspiration from the Stoic school of philosophy. There was an earlier Roman named Epictetus, 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 who was a former slave, actually, but became a great Stoic writer, and Marcus Aurelius is drawing a lot from him. So, with Marcus Aurelius, there's no pretense here, really, of originality. He is trying to, drawing on these Greek and Roman Stoic sources and then trying to distill them and provide something that might be helpful for people. What I want to do from this point on is just draw your attention to some of the Stoic themes in Marcus Aurelius's philosophy, because the question should be, okay, well, Marcus Aurelius is a kind of Stoic. What does that mean? What do Stoics believe? How is Marcus Aurelius Stoic? So let me give you some Stoic themes so that you can put these on your radar and be looking for them as you read. One of the Stoic themes that comes through really very strongly in this reading is that we should trust in providence. So there is such a thing as providence that governs the world. We might call it the Logos, Logos. That's what the Stoics tended to call it. We might call it God. But the important point is that there is a kind of divine power that is moving and shaping the world in a particular way, bringing about what is best for the entire universe. Might not be the best for me or you personally, but providence is always going to make sure that whatever is best for the universe, that is what is going to happen. This is a very stark contrast to another philosophical school that emerged around the same time. You may remember hearing about the Epicureans. Epicureans believed that everything was random. There's no rhyme or reason to things. There's no deeper purpose or meaning to human history. Stoics and Marcus Aurelius disagree. I also want you to pay attention to his view of the gods. Certainly, Marcus Aurelius believes in the gods, and the gods are sort of the instrument of providence. They help kind of bring about whatever it is that providence wants. They care about human beings. So not only do the gods exist, but they care about human beings, and they give us the ability to avoid true evils. And I want you to think about that when you read. What does Marcus Aurelius mean when he says that the gods allow us to avoid true evils? Because you might think, well, look, I'm still going to get sick. I'm still going to die. Aren't those things evil? Marcus Aurelius would actually say, no, they are not. So why would he say that? So again, I mentioned that Marcus Aurelius his philosophy is a pious philosophy, and this is one way in which that is true. It acknowledges the gods. It acknowledges the benevolence of the gods. And in fact, he says at one point in your reading that everyone should die with your heart full of thanksgiving to the gods. So gratitude toward the gods is an important component of his philosophy. A second theme to follow, which is related to the first, and that is that we should live according to our reason. Remember, the first point is the world is reasonable because there is a providence that is sort of shaping events for particular purposes. Well, we ourselves should live according to the reason implanted in us. Now, this is not something that's specifically Stoic. I mean, Plato, Aristotle, pretty much all Greek philosophers would say living according to your reason is a good idea. So you're going to hear a lot about this in your reading. Don't let reason become your slave. It's the part of you that was meant to rule you. Let it rule you. And of course, we have to consider what's competing for rule. If we're not being ruled and governed by our reason, what are we being ruled and governed by? Well, read Ovid, read the Metamorphoses. What are those characters governed by? Their passions, their furors. Okay? And one of the passions that Marcus Aurelius is most wary of, and I think you'll see this pretty clearly, is the fear of death. The fear of death has the power to really hold us in thrall, to make us behave irrationally, to live irrationally. And Marcus Aurelius says, no, you cannot let the fear of death overcome you. In fact, what's essential is that you think about death rationally. And if you think about death rationally, you'll see that it's nothing but an operation of nature. It's nothing to fear. You don't really lose anything at all in death except for the present moment. And that's not something that you should be terrified about. That's not something that you should be having sleepless nights about. One last theme to look for, and this is very characteristically Stoic, and that is this. There are things in life, many things in life, that we cannot control. So focus only on what you can control. You can't control other people's thoughts. You can't control what other people are thinking about you or saying about you, but you can control your own thoughts. So get your own thoughts in order. Get your own house in order. Act proactively. When you do something, do it with a clear intention. Do it with a purpose. Okay? And he says at one point, this is section 16, he says that the proper intention that should be driving us at every moment of our lives is to obey the reason and law of the one hallowed city and republic, Rome, right? So that should be our ever-present conscious intention to honor and obey the laws of Rome. So there's that third P, the political aspect of his philosophy. As a reading tip, one thing that I would actually suggest is reading the last paragraph first, because the last paragraph has a great summary and distillation of so many of these themes. So maybe start by reading the last paragraph first, then go back and read the rest. Let me say one last thing about this, and we'll be done. Stoicism is a philosophy for everyone. Isn't it interesting? The two most famous Roman Stoics, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, one of them was a former slave. The other was a Roman emperor, right? So opposite poles of Roman society, and yet they both found great value and meaning in Stoicism. And that's because Stoicism is all about cultivating your inner self. Your outward status doesn't matter. You're a slave, you're a farmer, you're an emperor, doesn't matter. You need to attend to your own inner thoughts, your own inner self. And as I mentioned a moment ago, the real question is, are you simply going to live reactively, sort of sleepwalking through life, and something happens and you just react sort of impulsively? Or are you going to live proactively? Are you going to wake up every morning with a sense of purpose and intention, and let that purpose and intention guide you all throughout the day? So even though this is a text written by a Roman emperor, I think Marcus Aurelius at least believed that the meditations could be of value to anybody on any stratum of Roman society. Okay, I'll leave it at that.